Thanks very much, Gabby, and thanks for everybody for coming. I'd also like to thank Phil Armstrong, our lecturer, very much for making this evening's event possible. We've been running events for about 5 years now, and this is very much a high point. Sadly, Phil couldn't be with us this evening, otherwise he'd be doing the introduction, not me. But how wonderful it is to welcome Professor Richard Wilkinson, whose work has changed the way many of us think about fairness and well-being in our societies. Richard has spent much of his career studying how the gap between the rich and the poor shapes the quality of our lives. Together with Kate Pickett, who we saw poke her head around the door a moment ago, he, of course, co-authored The Spirit Level, a book that sparked conversations around the world by showing that more equal societies are healthier, happier, and stronger communities for everyone, and not just for those at the bottom. And through their work with the Equality Trust and the follow-up book, The Inner Level, they've continued to show how inequality even affects our minds, our relationships, and our sense of security. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing Richard speak to us this evening. So thank you very much for being with us, Professor Wilkinson, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be with you. I find it a bit difficult to think what I should cover in this because I know some of you have seen one or other of my TED Talks, but not all of you will have. So it seems to me whatever I cover, some of you will feel it's all too familiar, and others will feel if I don't cover it, it should be covered. So I'm going to what I'm going to do actually is try and show the strength of the evidence that when we talk about economics and economic relationships and interactions and so on, we are also talking about social behavior, social relationships. And I think that's going to be a thread all the way through what I have to say. So I'm going to share my screen. I think it's that one. Yes. So you can see that, I guess. Can you all? Yes. Okay. So I thought I'd start just by pointing out, although Kate has updated the data in our Spirit Level book, which came out, I think, in 2009 or 10, and had data from several years earlier. She updated it all 15 years later. This is just to give you an idea of the sort of scatter of inequality. The top one is the Spirit Level data from World Bank or OECD, I can't remember which. And it's the ratio of top to bottom 20% of incomes in each society. So you can see there's more than a twofold difference there. Really quite remarkable, the scale of differences in inequality. The bottom one is a different measure of inequality. There are papers that compare different measures in their relationship to all sorts of outcomes. It doesn't matter really which measure you use because the more unequal one way are the same as the more unequal the other way. It just changes the order slightly, but it doesn't change the overall statistical relationships. And basically, the updated figures in relationships with health and social problems between inequality and health and social problems look very, very similar in the update as they did in the Spirit Level. And this is the graph that I think is best known, where we put all the data together. It's the international available data from the most respected sources, so WHO for life expectancy, OECD for the PISA maths and literacy scores for kids. Infant mortality is OECD. Homicides, I think there's an international, no, that actually might be OECD again. It might be, yeah, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, trust is the World Values Survey. Obesity is the International Obesity Task Force. Mental illness is, I think, OECD, and some figures on social mobility. And you get this extraordinary relationship between an index in which all those things are weighted equally. And in case you think that we've just chosen outcomes that suit our argument that inequality is a powerful influence on the character of our societies, we also looked at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, containing, I think, about 40 different components designed to measure well-being in the rich countries. It slopes downwards rather than upwards because here low scores show a country is doing badly, whereas before on the previous it was high scores. So it's basically the same relationship. And uh, I've included this one simply because I think people feel sometimes that inequality is justified if everyone can find the appropriate position in society. You know, the idea that if you work hard, you move up, and if you don't, you move down, and that explains social gradients in all sorts of outcomes. What this graph shows is that with more inequality, there is less social mobility. This is intergenerational social mobility. So what it's really asking is do rich parents have rich children and poor parents have poor children? And basically, make your parents' income makes much less difference if you're in a more equal society. Now, I said I wanted to emphasize the relationship between economic relationships and social relationships. And of course, inequality puts us in a hierarchy, one above the other, as if the best are at the top and the worst are at the bottom. And it changes social relationships. It changes how we treat each other and what we feel about ourselves. Um, our sense of our own self-worth, our social confidence, and so on, because inequality increases the idea that some people are worth more than others and are better than others. And so, you know, if that's true, what do people think of me? Those self-doubts come crowding in. And we just have to get to a point where people are not thinking that somehow economics and economic relationships are detached from the real social issues. I want just to take you through one of the ways in which inequality affects social relationships in this public sphere. This shows that participation in local groups, voluntary organizations diminishes with more inequality. You're probably less likely to know your neighbors, but certainly community life is weaker in more unequal societies. The same goes for trust, big differences in how much people feel they can trust others. This is a graph of, you know, those experiments where wallets are left around as if lost, and the question is how many get returned to the people the addresses in them suggest they belong to. And in more unequal societies, only about 20% come back to the owners, whereas in the more equal societies, top left, it is nearer 80%. So we're dealing with huge differences in important measures of uh, social interaction, social norms, and so on. They call this, the authors of this paper, they call it civic honesty. One of the most well uh, researched relationships is this one with violence. This is homicide rates. Um, in American states with Canadian provinces down at the bottom. But note the scale of the differences related to inequality. Down at the bottom left, you've got about 15 homicides per million population, and it goes up to 10 times as high as that in the more unequal American states. Incidentally, when we controlled for gun ownership, the relationship becomes slightly tighter. Um, this relationship is not simply a reflection of gun ownership. And I think there are a few countries, I believe, is it Finland? But a few places have surprisingly high gun ownership and low homicide. But what I'm really showing you these last few graphs for is what happens with growing inequality, greater inequality, is that you move from societies where there's good community life, people trust each other, to societies where actually people are frightened of each other. If you look at much more unequal societies than the ones in our data, this is Mexico, where we were asked to give some lecture, you find street after street all the houses are barricaded. These great big fences, razor wire around the top, bars on the windows and doors, and they tell you not to go out at night. So with really great inequality, you not only lose the community life, it gets to a point where people are frightened of each other. And just the same in South Africa, another of the world's most unequal societies. And those wires at the top are, of course, an electric fence. And this notice, you can just about read it. It says armed response. So if you're caught climbing in, you might get shot. Now, the real tragedy of this is that if you look at papers on the determinants of happiness and well-being and so on, even health, uh, really important is the quality of social relationships. Whether you're involved in community life, how many friends you have, things like that. Really powerful protectors of health. Death rates twice as high amongst people more socially isolated than people with lots of friends. Um, and so what's happening is that inequality is, in a way, it's undermining the core of the quality of life. The quality of life in rich societies is now a matter of the quality of social relationships. And that's where inequality does its most obvious damage. And actually, what I've been saying about the effects of inequality is also shown on from a quite different angle by this paper by Bowles and Jayadev, showing that with more inequality, um, more of the labor force in each country is involved in what they called guard labor. That means security staff, police, prison officers, basically all the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. And I think that looking at it from that very different perspective, in a way, it leaves you with no doubt that that's what inequality does to us. And so again, one must not be discussing economic policy, economic issues without at the same time thinking of their social consequences. Yeah, I think what we're dealing with is, although sociologists have talked about how to classify people at different levels in the social hierarchy, what matters most is how far apart the social classes, how far there is between top and bottom, if you like. Whether we're talking about a very steep social hierarchy like that or a much shallower one like that. Don't think of income differences as some completely new determinant of everything, because, of course, um, we all know that outcomes on all sorts of things are worst in the poorest areas of our cities. Health is worst there, violence is worst there, um, educational performance of children is worst there. And it's those problems with social gradients that get worse across the whole society with more inequality. Um, the biggest effects of inequality are on the poor, but well, almost all. We don't have separate data on the super rich, but 90% of us certainly do less well in more unequal societies. Now, I want to say a few words about why inequality goes so deep. I think we're dealing with our evolved psychology. I sometimes say that to understand the effect of inequality, you have to understand monkey dominance hierarchies. That's where the understanding comes from, perhaps more than from, for instance, Marx. Um, Carol Shively studied macaques in captivity. She's pointing out the very furred up arteries in a subordinate animal in the hierarchy. On the left of her screen is the clear artery of a dominant animal. And of course, that pattern we see associated with social status amongst humans. Amongst humans, we never knew whether it was the material conditions or what that was responsible for the worse health amongst people of lower status. She was able to keep her animals in the same compounds and give them the same diets. And still she saw these effects. She could also manipulate social status by moving animals into different groups, where an animal might in one group be further up or further down than it was in the other. And Robert Sapolsky, I think he calls himself a neuroanatomist or endocrinologist at Stanford, studied baboons in the Serengeti in the wild. He darts them and takes blood samples in a minute or two they're unconscious, and then analyzes the blood hormones and finds again the effects of social status. But you see, we always thought, studying health inequalities, that we were looking for the material differences associated with social class that explain the excess mortality in one and lower down the social hierarchy. But what they really made us aware of is social status itself is an important determinant of health, working through chronic stress. And so recognition of that came along at the same time as we began to recognize the health impact of chronic stress. And so the chronic stress of social status differences and low social status. And so, for instance, this from the Whitehall studies of civil servants. These graphs show fibrinogen, which is a blood clotting factor. And if you're a low status monkey, you want your blood to clot fast because you're going to get more bitten, you're going to get attacked, and so on. If you get wounded, you want to stop bleeding quickly. And so fibrinogen levels are affected by stress. And what you're seeing here, the high status civil servants are number one, and the low status civil servants are number six. So the blood of low status, yes, the blood of low status civil servants is behaving rather as if people still felt they were going to be bitten by their superiors, physically attacked. So I think we're looking at effects that are very deep responses in our evolved psychology. That doesn't mean we have to live in unequal hierarchical societies. We know that for 95% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings, we lived in egalitarian societies which do not trigger these responses. This is, another graph showing really the same primitive responses, if you like, to hierarchy. This is an experiment in which women were shown faces of men which had been, I think, some of them, the jawlines enhanced, made to look more masculine, tougher, and so on. And women were asked which face do they prefer. A preference for the more masculinized faces, if you like, the strong man, the male at the top, and so on of the hierarchy, that is accentuated with greater inequality. This is in the proceedings of the Royal Society. Also, women feeling they have to sell themselves on sexual attractiveness more. A similar pattern that women showed online more sexy pictures of themselves in more unequal societies, and interestingly related to inequality in the whole society, not so much to gender differences in inequality. So it's a response to the same issues to do with dominance and subordination across the whole society. So I've forgotten, maybe I've got it here. I was going to read, have it here? No, I don't. There was an extraordinary study in which people in poverty, in both rich and poor societies, were interviewed about their experience of poverty. And in some societies, living in poverty, what they call poverty, was meant in conditions like that on the right. In a country like Norway, living in poverty means living in a 2 or 3 bedroom centrally heated flat with most of the modern electronics. And yet the experience of poverty was very similar, a sense of failure, of being looked down on, of being disrespected, all those the psychosocial effects of social comparisons. And of course, the material factors are important determinants of health, very important, but you have to recognize that poverty is also about psychosocial factors and how you feel you're judged and seen and so on. And actually, those kinds of stressor to do with how you're seen and judged are particularly powerful in their effects on levels of our biological stress hormones. This is a meta-analysis of a lot of, I think, over 200 studies in which people are given stressful tasks to do while having their stress hormones, principally cortisol, measured. You can measure it in saliva or in the blood. And what the meta-analysis showed that what really pushes up your stress hormone levels is tasks which include social evaluative threats to social status or self-esteem where others can judge you negatively. That's a quote from the study. Things which are just difficult, like mathematical problems, don't have those effects. It's these social issues that are so important. And apparently, even people who say, oh, well, I'm not, I know other people are bothered by social status, but I'm not. If you take these blood samples or saliva, you get a different story. We're all bothered by these things. Stereotype threat experiments, where, and this is a very old experiment published by the World Bank. Indian kids from high and low castes asked to do little pen and paper tests. They did them in two conditions, one where they didn't know who was high and low caste, and they did equally well. But as soon as they did know who was high and who was low caste, a big gap opens up between the performance. And we now know whether you're looking at the stereotype threat by class or ethnicity, you get similar effects. You see that our performance on a whole range of outcomes is affected by uh, feeling you're judged negatively or worries about that. Now, when we wrote the spirit level, we were rather guessing at what the psychosocial mechanisms were behind all the correlations between inequality and how kids do at school or violence or whatever. And but then along came this study some years after the spirit level came out, in order rather to test our guesses about mechanism. And along the bottom here, you've got the deciles of income distribution in each country. The poorest 10th on the left, the richest 10th on the right. And what you're seeing here is levels of status anxiety or worries about how you're seen and judged. The top line is the levels of status anxiety in the more unequal countries. Higher levels of status anxiety, highest, of course, amongst the least well off, but everyone's status anxiety is exacerbated by more inequality in their society. And then that bottom line, lower levels of status anxiety. So we all become more twitchy about how we're seen and judged in more unequal societies. Really important, feeding into all those stress mechanisms that I've mentioned. Oh yes, the way, and of course, if you're worried about how you're seen and judged, one of the responses we all have is to spend more money on how we look. Everything from clothes to a better car or better phone or living in a better part of town, all these things that, they're about, in a way, selling ourselves to each other. Giving other people a more positive idea of ourselves. And I suspect that status consumption is a very major part of what drives consumption in rich societies. And we know that for decades, during which we had economic growth, we had no improvement in happiness and well-being. Health, measured in death rates, went on improving until fairly recently in some countries, but unrelated to economic growth. And so our economic growth has not been producing real benefits for some time. And I think this is really important in terms of how we deal with the burden on the planet of consumption and the size of our economies. I think the status consumption, as advertising suggests, is a really major part of wasteful, excessive consumption. That it's about status consumption is zero sum across the whole society. I do better if I move up, but if I move up, then the people I've overtaken have moved, as it were, down a wee bit, or the other way round. So it's across the whole society, status competition is a zero sum game. And there are now a number of studies that show if you live in a more unequal society, you spend more on these status goods, whether you're looking at clothes with the right labels or upmarket cars or whatever. I'm appalled by just going shopping and see how many BMWs, Audis, Jaguars, and so on. People spending more than they easily can in order to look good. It's a sad commentary on our society. But the advertisers know this very well and are always pushing it. This is a disgusting ad, I think, that, if you don't buy their stuff, it's because you're not worth it. What is that next one? I thought it was the slide. Yeah. Number of authorities are saying that greater equality is a precondition for sustainability. And I think the main reason they're saying it is because of the huge environmental footprint of the very rich. But of course, there are knock-on effects to the consumption of the whole of the rest of society as we try and maintain a sort of idea of respectability and being seen positively and so on, and that status competition. I'll jump over that. Yeah, dominance behavioral system is important, and it again shows how deeply these things go. Sherry Johnson, a psychologist at Berkeley in California, showed that a huge range of mental illnesses and personality disorders are either triggered or exacerbated by status differences. And actually, we now know that those conditions are more common in more unequal societies. If you're worried about how you're seen and judged, you can become depressed, you can feel that social gatherings are too stressful, you start avoiding meeting other people, you feel you're not good enough, not attractive enough, whatever. And yet there is also the opposite response. If you're worried about how you're seen and judged, you find ways of mentioning your achievements in every conversation and bigging yourself up. Where is it? Yeah, this kind of thing, a sort of kind of Trump self-presentation. But both those, feeling you're not good enough, withdrawing from social life, or the narcissism, flaunting your achievements, exaggerating them, both more common in more unequal societies. And yeah, I should have, maybe it's coming. evidence that mental illnesses of various kinds are more common in more unequal societies. Oh yes, this is a paper from the British Medical Journal, Open. It is looking at data from the 36 OECD countries, looking at the various conditions listed on the left, and the length of the blue lines is the correlation coefficient with inequality in those 36 countries. So you can see that most of those conditions are much more common in more unequal OECD countries. Suicide and alcoholism insignificantly the other way round. There's a paper on schizophrenia, more common in more unequal societies, drug use. And we use drugs in a way like alcohol to ease social meetings because they're stressful. You have a drink before you go to a party, maybe, all that kind of thing. But in a way, I think right at the bottom of all this is something we can get to by the contrast between what social status means in terms of dominance hierarchies and pecking orders. They're orderings based on power, coercion, privileged access to resources amongst animals with dominance hierarchies and reflections of that in our societies, and friendship. The social status issues, particularly low social status, very damaging to health, damaging to the social fabric, but friendship, absolutely the opposite. Having friends, you feel better about yourself. There are people who like you. They actually choose your company. They think you're a nice person. So in a way, I think those are the two opposite ways human beings can come together. You see, as in almost any species, there is competition for scarce resources. Members of the same species have the same needs. They eat the same stuff. They need the same shelter. They compete for sexual partners. So there is always within a species the problem of potential conflict. And either we deal with that through social status, which means we fight a bit less often because I realize you will win because I know you're stronger than me, so I give way and don't fight. Or friendship, which is about sharing, the recognition of each other's needs. And of course, the gift is the symbol of friendship, because it's the concrete gesture which says, look, I'm not going to fight you for access. I give you this. And so for at least 90% of our human existence, we lived in highly egalitarian hunters and gathering societies. And it was this anthropologist, Marshall Salins, who studied hunting and gathering societies all his life, who said this: gifts make friends and friends make gifts. And of course, we still use gifts like that. And we eat together as a form of social cement. And although, if you came to dinner with me, I would be astonished and refuse it if you offered to pay for the meal. If you needed a postage stamp and I gave it to you, it might be quite common to offer to pay me the few pence that it cost. So, food sharing, there's still something special about that, eating together. And of course, in religious circles, the communion is about sharing the necessities of life, the bread and the wine and so on. And words like companion. Your companions are the people you share the necessities of life with, Con and Pan. So a lot of stuff showing that these fundamental issues are part of our evolved psychology. We're not free of them. I don't know whether I should stop at that point to leave some time for questions. Would you like me to, Gabrielle, or shall I just
That would be great.
explain
There's
a
a couple
few of
of
the
questions.
trends in inequality?
There's a couple of questions coming up in
Okay,
the
let's have
text
them.
here. So perhaps I'll start. Let me just scroll back through. Well, there's an easy one from one of our master's students has asked if it might be possible to get a hold of the slides later. There's a couple of studies in there that some people would like to delve into a bit more deeply.
Yeah,
Would that be?
I'll send you the slides when I
That would be
finish.
marvelous. Thank you. Thank you. Patrick's asked, which I guess touches back on the MMT frame, which we obviously go into very deeply in the course. Patrick's asked, do we have to change the way most people understand how public money works before we can create more equal societies? Do you think that the myth of having something like a zero-sum game prevents people from actually demanding a more equal society?
Yes, I think that status competition is why most people would resist increased taxes, progressive taxation, and so on. Why and our government is in real trouble with thinking it's got to balance the books a bit more, and they endlessly um, feel they've got to cut services rather than tax the rich. And it's extraordinary, but and people believe that their income is what they deserve. They believe it's the value of what they've contributed to society. But of course, it's not at all. There isn't really a relationship between pay and what people contribute. Even the economic theory says that the value of your pay is only the value of what you contribute to the company. And of course, a lot of companies, their effects on society are pretty antisocial.
Yeah.
And so you're helping an antisocial exercise. But actually, if you look at CEO pay in relation to company performance, in some studies show no relationships. Others show that actually that the companies that pay their CEOs most, the company performs less well than ones
Yeah.
where they pay them less. And extraordinary myths that our hierarchy is based on. And those are sustained, I think, by everyone feeling their income is so precious because it's key to their status. And that's what
Yeah.
we're in a really unequal environment. And so that's how we respond. But in an equal society, all that drops away. And if you don't believe me about that, read the papers from early anthropologists about hunters and gatherers, people who lived in those societies and studied them in detail.
I have a question on early hunter-gatherer societies, but I won't sort of hog the limelight here. I'd like to perhaps read one by David, who's asked about your thoughts perhaps on Japan. I'll read what he's commented here. I, like many others, prefer more equal pre-distribution rather than redistribution, and fear that the latter will just reinforce the narrative that the rich are needing to provide for the rest. However, Japan seems to do pretty well on most metrics, despite relying more on redistribution, I think. Perhaps I'm missing some Japanese specific cultural factors to square this circle.
Yeah, well, when we wrote the spirit level, we didn't just look at different countries, we also looked at the 50 states of the USA. And it did seem to us that some societies and some American states got their greater equality through redistribution, through taxes and benefits, and some through pre-distribution. The equality of income before taxation. And it looked to us as if it didn't matter which way you got your greater equality, it had similar effects. And yes, our impression was that Japan was more equal. It's become less equal since the spirit level, but it then got its greater equality through pre-distribution. The same was true of the American states. Some American states one way and some the other. And you said something in the preamble to that question, worries about making the rich feel that we're all dependent on them. But actually, of course, the rich are dependent on the rest of the population. And a few of the richest people have acknowledged that if they were in a completely different social and material environment, they would not have been able to make their millions. Depended on being in the right place at the right time, and they depend on transport systems and education and health systems and power stations and all the rest of it. So in a way, the wealth of a society is a joint project, and the rich just take more out of that than the rest of us.
Thank you.
I say than the rest of us, but of course people at the level of most academics and professors and so on are really part of the rich.
Yeah, I get, yes, we must acknowledge that as well, absolutely. Tom's asked about, could Richard cover relationships between inequality and climate change? Perhaps a little on your update, 15-year update to the spirit level.
Well, we find that there's a relationship between how much inequality there is and carbon emissions per $100 of GNP or something, between recycling and inequality. And Kate my partner, is keener on those relationships. They exist, but I'm more feel I'm in the dark about what the mechanisms are. I think I understand the mechanisms in the problems with social gradients. But so I believe that those relationships exist, but I don't feel I really have a proper understanding of why they exist. But I don't have. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, the more equal countries, they certainly do better in lots of environmental measures. We've just seen how USA is not only a very poor performer in environmental terms, but it's just got much worse under Trump, cancelling the bits that they did do to preserve the planet.
That might speak
Interestingly, I remember
leadership.
seeing a paper that says if America on its own was to take major action on carbon emissions, although they're only part of the world picture, it would still benefit them enough to pay for itself.
There's so many questions here, so many great questions, actually. Can I read this one from Miles, which is related to health? Miles asks, what are your thoughts about status and hierarchy within the health professions and where they are inclined to work, and also the growing inequality between health professionals and the people that they treat, endocrinologists and people with type 2 diabetes, for example?
Probably can't go into the details, but I always used to quote something called white coat hypertension. You're smiling, Gavi, as if
I have that.
you're familiar with it. But I feel at ease when my doctor takes my blood pressure, because I feel equal status with the doctor, whereas some people feel they're in the presence of someone who is much higher status. And so in that context, blood pressure seems to be higher than when it's monitored continuously. I think it has all sorts of effects. You know, people are, because they're feeling stressed, don't hear, don't listen as carefully to what the doctor is saying to them, don't ask the questions they intended to. I think that in a way, and although our health services has been underfunded through a long period of Conservative government, it's our local health service here in York has done absolutely splendidly from my point of view. You know, I had cancer of the colon. It was caught before I had any symptoms of any feelings of illness. Just my blood, I was slightly anemic, and they realized that might be an indication of internal bleeding and so on. The whole thing was dealt with before there was any spread. I never had to have chemotherapy or radiation. And, you know, the system working really well despite the pressure and underfunding. And the fact that it is
Very
so
glad.
treasured as the one service that provides things that we all need and value free, makes it something that politicians, they can't suddenly privatize the system. They realize that, and in a way that should be a pointer to the kind of society we should be moving towards. And I think that there should be many more public goods, and that maybe is becoming easier. And everything that's digitized can be reproduced ad infinitum. And so it's only to serve the profits of business that access to digitized materials is restricted. But basically, we should be offering the producers of digitized materials, we should be saying, okay, will you accept £100,000 to make your programs, your film, whatever it is, available to the population? We should be making that kind of deal. And the move in production towards lower marginal costs, you know, that book, Zero Marginal Cost Society, it's paving the way for a society in which public goods are a much more important part of total consumption. And that is also, like the health service, a way of reducing inequalities, to have more things that are not determined, where access is not determined by income.
I'm just wondering if perhaps you could unshare your screen just so that we get a
Yes, of
chance
course.
to. Thank you.
Unshare, stop share, yes.
Go.
Okay, I'm back again.
So we can see your face. And I wanted to maybe just read quickly one or two of the lovely comments here. Gabby, who is a different Gabby than me, but I second this. Lovely to hear from Richard. I work in health promotion, and Richard's research has had a big influence on my work. And some other people have thanked you kindly for the gift of your time to speak with us. This lecture is a gift. Some lovely compliments there. I wonder, I know we've sort of used up our hour, but there's some other questions. Would you be happy to take a few more?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have thoughts on, somebody's asked about the UBI, the idea of a UBI, universal basic income. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm keen on it and hope that it'll become essential if AI and automation starts destroying jobs, that we'll have to move towards a different society. One of the reasons I hope that will be something that pushes us to a really not just a minimal universal basic income, but something bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I value it also because I think we have to find some way of moving away from wage labor, where you see, wage labor, the wage is an extrinsic motivation. And the intrinsic motivation for work is, what makes you interested in your work, what makes you feel valued as a person making a contribution to society or whatever. And you might think that only middle-class jobs allow that feeling. But of course, when people are unemployed, one of the most obvious things is they feel useless, worthless. Jobs do provide some sense of making a valued contribution. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence that show that extrinsic motivation does what they call crowds out intrinsic motivation. So if you're paid a wage for something, you're more likely to think that is why I work. And one of the things about retirement is you suddenly, and I go on doing roughly the same thing in retirement as I did when I was at work.
Stephen would agree.
I now know that the only reason I'm doing it is because I've chosen to do it.
Yeah.
And actually, I
That is a
rather
great
disliked
gift.
the institutional setup I was in. I felt I worked better at home.
Well, I think I can say for Stephen and myself and perhaps some others on this call, the work that we do is something that we do with or without a wage. So we're one of few people, I guess, or I'm certainly grateful that I get to come and do what I do every day. I think perhaps we could end with one last question, which there is a little bit of a discussion thread about that, and asking about your thoughts about why politicians won't make inequality a priority, reducing inequality, acting on it.
Why they do or why they
Why
don't?
they don't.
I think it's related to the fact that people regard their income as a key to social status. There are these justifications of social hierarchy, a belief that, where you are in society is a reflection of whether you got what it takes, your innate intelligence or whatever. I think it's important to recognize actually that the people whose research used to be about looking for the gene for intelligence, that research program has really, it seems to me, collapsed since it was possible to decode our genetic makeup cheaply, so you can do it in large surveys. It's now clear that there are thousands of genes affecting cognitive characteristics of different kinds. None of us have them all, and probably none of us are without any. And it's quite clear that if you'd been a hunter and gatherer, you could have had all the genes for being good at mathematics, and yet you wouldn't have been able to do simple division. that actually whether you're good at bad at anything is a matter of education and learning, and actually our ability at different things, and there are differences in ability related to social status, they are more a reflection of where we are in society than an explanation of how we get to where we are. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. I can't remember what the question was, but I probably
About
completely lost it.
Well, I guess it was about how we can, the broader question is about how we can convince the people who are
yes,
in
politicians.
charge to
Well,
steer the ship in the
about,
opposite direction than it's going at the moment.
yeah, pre-distribution earlier, and I think that the conservative side of politics, there is you are more likely to be able to convince them that measures of economic democracy, employee representation on company boards is beneficial. And I think that's the thin end of the wedge we should be driving in to democratize, extend democracy into the economy. And I think also that the links between, I said that greater equality was a precondition for sustainability. I think we can also use that as a basis for convincing politicians. But I also think that basically the rise of the far right and populism is partly a reflection of inequality, but that and the fact that inequality has risen is also an indication of the failure of the left. And I do think there is, in some of our countries, an untapped desire for a radical left party. It's interesting that Corbyn now and Sarah, I can't remember her surname, but another MP starting what they've called Your Party, but it'll get another name soon.
Dara Sultana?
800,000 people have signed up to it, which makes it bigger than all our other political parties put together, which shows an enormous untapped desire for a radical alternative. And I think if we'd grown effective left parties, we wouldn't have had the rise of inequality, and we wouldn't have the far right populism.
We should strike like the French do.
Yeah. So they only do a little bit better than us.
I was going to say.
We could at least start, yes. All right. Well, I think we haven't got to everybody's questions. I'm so sorry about that. If you've missed out, there were quite a lot. The meeting chat was very quiet at the beginning, and then all of a sudden people wrote reams, and it's been very interesting to read all of that as we went along as well. So thank you so much for your contributions in that chat thread, and thank you so much, Richard. We are so privileged to have you speaking with us, and it's a perfect time. We're just between our trimesters, so it's a great.
What's the name of the pussycat? Gabby, ask that question.
Marcus wants to know your cat's name.
Lyra. I didn't name it Lyra. It is the most sociable cat. You can make it purr by looking at it.
Oh, goodness.
It obviously wants attention just like the rest of us.
Well, I was in the middle of thanking Richard, so perhaps I'll stop the recording and we can just take ourselves off mute and give a bit of a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for letting me do it. It's very easy to do.
Well, thank you so much.